everyone, welcome to another installment of Movement Monday. Today I wanted to discuss the concept of posterior pelvic tilt. And that is just a fancy way of describing one of the ways in which the pelvis moves. So of course when we discuss the pelvis, we're talking about kind of your hip bones basically and how it relates to your spine. Don't want to get too fancy, don't want to get too bogged down in the terminology and the physiology of how that works. What I do want you to understand is why it's important to have awareness as far as motor control for this movement, how it applies to your exercises and working out. So, briefly, the posterior pelvic tilt is when the pelvis goes from a neutral position, i.e. standing, to somewhat of a flexed position like this. It's a little bit subtle. So that's a posterior pelvic tilt. Here's neutral. And here is anterior pelvic tilt. So we have those three kind of different positions for the pelvis. One of them is squeezing your butt, flexing underneath. That's the posterior pelvic tilt. Anterior pelvic tilt is kind of when you arch your back. And then of course neutral, where you're in between both of those. Some people have a sort of natural posture that puts them in one or the other, but you know, for the sake of terminology, we'll just consider most people when they're neutral are neither posteriorly tilted or anteriorly tilted. Why is understanding how to posteriorly tilt the pelvis? Why is that important? It's important because when you do certain exercises, engaging in that posterior tilt will help you actually remain neutral and protect your back, okay? In addition to that, it will help you get more bang for your buck out of your glute exercises. So I want to go over again what that posterior tilt looks like and how you can kind of engage into it, and then I'll show you a couple of exercises where it is important to really understand how to do that. So again, when we stand up, just hanging out, nothing really going on. This is our neutral sort of pelvis, and as you can see, just kind of a neutral spine. If I squeeze my butt and tilt my hips kind of underneath, like a dog who's scared tucks his tail underneath him, that's what's happening with the posterior pelvic tilt. It is important to engage in that with exercises such as the plank. Let's see if I can get a little bit better view here. Exercises like the plank. If I don't engage in posterior tilt, I might look like this in my plank, which is bad. It hurts my back. But if I engage, tuck my hips underneath, squeeze my butt, now I have some glute activation, core activation, and it makes for a much better movement. Now that's the plank, but it also, of course, applies to when I do my push-ups. I want to make sure I'm in that position. Similar is the glute bridge. I want to make sure that I'm going to tilt my pelvis first before I drive up, okay? Those are all exercises that we call anti-extension because gravity is working against us to try to basically arch the spine under load, which we don't want, okay? So those movements are important to protect the back, increase the strength of the glutes. So developing motor control and awareness of how to move the pelvis will really benefit the exercises that you're doing, especially if you have any history of low back sort of pain, pathology, dysfunction, what have you. See, what else do we have to say about that? I think that's primarily it. Just so that you understand, again, sort of the difference, there are also flexion exercises. For example, I'm not going to necessarily posteriorly tilt when I do a deadlift. See how this wouldn't really make too much sense to do the posterior tilt. If I'm trying to posterior tilt in a deadlift, then I round my back out. You see how that's kind of this is an anti-flexion exercise. So I actually want to do the opposite and kind of arch. I want to arch and resist flexion in my back. So I want to stay nice and tight. Whereas again, in a push-up, I want to tilt and have almost a rounded back because gravity is trying to do this to me. Gravity, when I try to pull up a bar, is trying to do this to me. So hopefully that kind of demonstrates through contrast the difference between the posterior tilt, the anterior tilt. So maybe we'll do a longer segment that includes more examples of the anterior tilt as well. So we will add some images to this on the blog, so make sure that you check all that out. And whenever you're doing push-ups, glute bridges, and other stuff that I'll put into the blog post for examples, just again make sure that you're practicing that posterior pelvic tilt. All right, happy training.